Richard Walker stands frozen in the marble foyer of his flagship restaurant, his face pale as he stares at the legal documents in his trembling hands. The billionaire, who owns 17 restaurants across the state, has never felt this small, this exposed, this utterly caught off guard. The lawyer's voice echoes in his ears. "My client, Sarah Miller, is seeking full compensation for wrongful termination, public humiliation, and workplace harassment." Sarah Miller. The name hits him like a punch to the chest. The waitress he fired 3 days ago for daring to speak back to him. The woman whose dignity he crushed in front of 20 customers and half his staff. His mind races back to that moment. Her steady voice, her unflinching eyes, the way she refused to bow her head even as he stripped away her livelihood. He thought she would disappear quietly, like all the others before her. He was wrong. Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe so you never miss a story. Richard Walker built his restaurant empire on one simple principle: absolute control. Every detail, every decision, every person who worked for him existed to serve his vision. At 62, he commanded respect through fear, loyalty through intimidation. His restaurants were temples to perfection. Crystal chandeliers, imported marble, servers who moved like shadows. He walked through his establishments like a king surveying his kingdom, and everyone knew to stay out of his way. Sarah Miller had worked at his flagship location for 3 years. She was 34, a single mother of 2, and she needed this job more than she needed her pride. At least, that's what she told herself every morning when she put on the crisp white uniform and polished black shoes. She was good at her job, maybe too good. She remembered every regular customer's order, anticipated their needs, smoothed over kitchen delays with a warm smile. The other servers respected her. The customers asked for her by name. Richard noticed her, but not in the way most men noticed Sarah. He saw efficiency, competence, someone who made his restaurant run smoother without requiring his attention. Until the night everything changed. It was a Thursday evening, the dining room buzzing with the city's elite. Richard made his usual rounds, greeting VIP guests, ensuring everything met his impossible standards. He moved through the room with practiced authority, his sharp suit and cold eyes commanding instant deference. That's when he saw table 12. An elderly woman sat alone, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to cut her steak. Her wine glass was empty, her bread plate cleared away long ago. She looked tired, forgotten, the kind of customer who paid her bill quietly and left without causing trouble. Sarah approached the table with a fresh glass of water and a gentle smile. She bent down slightly, speaking in soft tones the woman could hear. Richard watched from across the room as Sarah helped adjust the elderly woman's napkin, refilled her wine glass without being asked, even helped steady her trembling hands as she lifted her fork. It should have been nothing, a server doing her job with unusual kindness. But something about the scene irritated Richard. The attention Sarah gave to this unremarkable customer. The time she spent at one table when others needed service. The way she seemed to care more about this woman's comfort than the restaurant's efficiency. He strode over, his jaw tight with annoyance. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice cutting through the dining room's quiet hum, "I believe you have other tables to attend to." Sarah looked up, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Of course, Mr. Walker, You were just spending too much time on one customer while others wait. This is not a charity organization." The elderly woman's face crumpled with embarrassment. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded once and stepped back. That should have been the end of it. Sarah should have smiled apologetically, moved to her other tables, let the moment pass like she always did. Instead, she met Richard's eyes directly. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "She's eating alone, Mr. Walker. Sometimes people need a little kindness with their meal." The dining room went silent. Even the kitchen noise seemed to pause. Every eye in the room turned toward their table, toward the waitress who had just done the unthinkable. She had talked back to Richard Walker. Richard's face turned to stone. In 30 years of business, no employee had ever challenged him publicly, not once. The audacity of it, the sheer disrespect, hit him like a slap across the face. "Excuse me?" His voice was low, dangerous, the kind of tone that made grown men apologize before they even knew what they'd done wrong. Sarah didn't apologize. She didn't back down. She stood straighter, her chin lifted slightly, and spoke clearly enough for the entire dining room to hear. "I said she's eating alone, sir. She's been a regular customer for 2 years. Her husband died last winter, and she comes here every Thursday because it was their anniversary restaurant." The elderly woman looked up with tears in her eyes, surprised that someone had noticed, that someone had cared enough to remember. Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: public challenge. Every customer was watching now, waiting to see how the billionaire would handle a waitress who dared to humanize his business. "Your job," Richard said, his voice rising slightly, "is to serve efficiently, not to play therapist to every customer who walks through that door." "My job," Sarah replied, her voice steady as bedrock, "is to make sure people feel welcome in your restaurant. That's what hospitality means, Mr. Walker. That's what your customers pay for." A murmur rippled through the dining room. Some customers nodded slightly. Others looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they weren't witnessing this unprecedented confrontation. Richard realized with growing horror that she was winning. This minimum wage server was making him look heartless in front of his most important customers. Her quiet dignity was exposing his coldness, her compassion highlighting his cruelty. He had 2 choices: back down or escalate. Richard Walker had never backed down from anything in his life. "You're fired," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Clear out your things and leave my restaurant immediately." Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't cry or beg or apologize. She simply nodded once, untied her apron with steady hands, and placed it on the table beside the elderly woman. "Mrs. Green, your meal is on the house tonight. You deserve to be treated with respect." Then she walked toward the staff exit, her back straight, her head high, leaving Richard standing alone beside table 12 while the entire dining room watched in stunned silence. The elderly woman, Mrs. Green, looked up at Richard with watery eyes. "That girl has more class than you'll ever have. And she's right about my husband. We came here every Thursday for 15 years. She stood up slowly, left $200 on the table, and walked out without another word. Richard stood there, surrounded by his expensive restaurant, his perfect ambiance, his intimidated staff, and realized that something fundamental had just shifted. For the first time in his adult life, he had won a battle, but felt like he'd lost something much more important. The next morning, Richard couldn't shake the image of Sarah walking away with her dignity intact, while he stood there looking like a tyrant. He told himself she was just another employee, easily replaceable, but the lie felt hollow, even to him. His general manager, Tom Carter, appeared in his office doorway looking uncomfortable. "We need to talk about last night," Tom said, closing the door behind him. "There's nothing to discuss," Richard snapped. "The Miller woman was insubordinate. I dealt with it appropriately." 6 customers called this morning, Tom continued quietly. 3 of them canceled their weekend reservations. 2 of them specifically mentioned Sarah by name. Richard's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. What did they say? That they've never seen anyone treat a customer with such genuine care, that they were disgusted by how you handled the situation. Mrs. Green called the restaurant a monument to arrogance and said she'd never set foot here again. The words hit Richard harder than they should have. Mrs. Green had been coming to his restaurant for 2 years, spending nearly $300 every Thursday night. Sarah had known her story, had cared about her loneliness, had treated her like family. He had treated her like an inconvenience. "And there's something else," Tom said, his voice even quieter. "Sarah's daughter goes to school with my nephew. She's 8 years old. Sarah was working double shifts here to save money for the girl's surgery next month. Something with her heart." The room seemed to spin slightly. Richard set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. A surgery, a child, a single mother working herself to exhaustion in his restaurant, and he had fired her for showing kindness to a lonely old woman? "Get out," he whispered. "Mr. Walker, maybe we should get out!" Richard roared, sweeping papers off his desk in a rage that had nothing to do with Tom and everything to do with the growing horror in his chest. Tom left quickly, closing the door behind him. Richard sat alone in his office, surrounded by awards and photographs and symbols of his success, and felt more isolated than he had in years. He thought about calling Sarah, but what would he say? That he was sorry? That he had made a mistake? Richard Walker didn't make mistakes. He made decisions, and he stood by them. But as the day wore on, as more customers called to complain, as his own staff began looking at him differently, Richard began to realize that some decisions carried consequences he hadn't anticipated. That evening, he drove past Sarah's apartment complex. It was a modest building in a decent neighborhood, the kind of place where working people raised their children and hoped for better days. He sat in his Mercedes, staring up at the lit windows, wondering which one was hers. He imagined her inside, explaining to her 8-year-old daughter why Mummy suddenly didn't have a job anymore, calling the hospital to discuss payment plans for a surgery that might now be delayed indefinitely. For the first time in decades, Richard Walker felt something that had been absent from his life for so long he barely recognized it: shame. 3 days later, the lawyer arrived. Richard was reviewing quarterly reports when his secretary buzzed him. "There's an attorney here to see you, Mr. Walker. She says it's about Sarah Miller." The name hit him like ice water. He had spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about that name, about what he had done, about the child who needed surgery and the mother who had dared to show compassion in his sterile kingdom. The lawyer was professional, composed, and utterly ruthless. She laid out Sarah's case with clinical precision: wrongful termination, public humiliation, workplace harassment, violation of employee rights. The evidence was damning. Security footage of the incident, witness statements from customers and staff, documentation of Sarah's exemplary work record. "My client isn't interested in revenge, Mr. Walker," the lawyer said calmly. "She wants her job back, full back pay, and a public apology. She also wants you to implement sensitivity training for all management staff." Richard sat in stunned silence. He had expected Sarah to disappear quietly, to nurse her wounds in private, like so many others before her. He had underestimated her completely. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we go to court. And given the publicity this case would generate, given your restaurant's reputation and your public profile, I don't think that would end well for you." After the lawyer left, Richard sat alone with the legal documents spread across his desk. Every page represented his failures, his coldness, his cruelty, his complete inability to see the human cost of his need for control. He thought about fighting the case. He had expensive lawyers, unlimited resources, the kind of legal firepower that could bury a single mother's lawsuit for years. But something had changed in him since that night. The man who had fired Sarah Miller would have fought viciously. The man sitting in this office now felt tired. He picked up his phone and dialed Tom Carter. "I want you to call Sarah Miller. Set up a meeting." "Sir? I heard me. I want to see her." There was a long pause. "Mr. Walker, are you sure about this?" Richard looked out his office window at the city below, at all the people living their small, important lives, while he sat in his tower, making decisions that affected them in ways he never bothered to consider. "No," he said honestly, "I'm not sure about anything anymore." The meeting was set for the next morning. Richard spent the night pacing his penthouse apartment, rehearsing words that sounded hollow even to him. How do you apologize for cruelty? How do you acknowledge that you've been wrong about everything that matters? He arrived at the restaurant early, before the morning prep began, before his staff could witness whatever was about to happen. Sarah arrived exactly on time, accompanied by her lawyer, looking composed and dignified in a simple dress that probably cost less than Richard's tie. She sat across from him at the same table where he had fired her, her hands folded calmly in her lap, waiting for him to speak first. Richard had planned a speech about misunderstandings and second chances, but looking at her now, this woman whose life he had disrupted with casual cruelty, all his prepared words died in his throat.
"I was wrong," Richard said finally, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Not just about firing you, about all of it." Sarah studied his face for a long moment before responding. "Why?" "Because you cared about Mrs. Green, because you saw her as a person instead of just another customer, because you had the courage to stand up to me when everyone else was too afraid." Sarah's expression didn't change. "Is that your apology, Mr. Walker?" Richard felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the restaurant's air conditioning. "You're trying to manage this situation," Sarah interrupted quietly, "the same way you manage everything else in your life. But this isn't about your restaurant or your reputation or your legal problems. This is about how you treat people." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. Even now, even in his remorse, he was thinking about damage control instead of genuine change. "My daughter asked me why you fired me. She's 8 years old, and she wanted to know why the man who owns the restaurant where Mommy works would be mean to the nice old lady who eats dinner by herself." Richard's throat tightened. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that sometimes people forget how to be kind, that power can make people lonely, and lonely people sometimes hurt others because they don't remember what it feels like to care." The simple wisdom of it, filtered through a child's understanding, left Richard speechless. He had built an empire, but lost his humanity somewhere along the way. He had gained everything he thought he wanted and realized too late that it meant nothing without compassion. "I'll take the job back," Sarah said after a long silence, "but not for the reasons you think." "Then why?" "Because Mrs. Green called me yesterday. She said she misses coming to the restaurant, that it was the one place she felt connected to her husband's memory. She asked if there was any chance she could have her Thursday table back." Richard nodded slowly. "Of course. Anything she wants." "And because my coworkers need someone to remind them that they matter, that treating people with dignity isn't a luxury, it's the whole point." Sarah stood up, extending her hand across the table. "I'll start Monday, but things are going to be different, Mr. Walker. I won't be afraid to speak up when someone needs an advocate. I won't pretend not to see when power is being used to hurt instead of help." Richard shook her hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard work, the strength of someone who had never had the luxury of giving up. "I understand." Do you? Sarah asked, her eyes searching his face. Because this isn't just about me getting my job back. This is about you deciding what kind of man you want to be. She left him sitting at table 12, the same table where Mrs. Green had eaten alone every Thursday, the same table where his cruelty had finally met someone with the courage to call it by name. That evening, Richard did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He made a reservation at his own restaurant, not to inspect or intimidate, but simply to eat dinner like any other customer. When Sarah approached his table, he ordered quietly and said please and thank you, like the words actually meant something. When Mrs. Green arrived for her Thursday dinner the following week, Richard personally escorted her to table 12, where Sarah was waiting with a warm smile and a glass of her favorite wine already poured. "Welcome back, Mrs. Green," Sarah said gently. "We've missed you." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "It's good to be home," she whispered. Richard watched from across the dining room as Sarah helped steady Mrs. Green's trembling hands, as she listened to stories about a husband who had been gone for nearly a year, as she treated this unremarkable customer like she was the most important person in the world. He understood now that this was what he had been missing all along. Not the efficiency or the profit or the perfect execution, but the simple human connection that turned a business transaction into an act of compassion. Sarah had taught him that true power isn't the ability to control others, it's the wisdom to lift them up. And sometimes the greatest victory is learning how to lose with grace.